Hello, Rational Roundtable. Thank you for your latest response. It does seem that we've found our way onto a number of classic points of conflict between the theistic and atheistic position, which have snowballed on us during the course of our exchange. In light of this, and while the series we've created together is still a manageable length for viewers, I'd like to make this my quote-unquote closing arguments video. I'll try to gather the threads together and to wrap up my thoughts coherently. However, let me say that I've really enjoyed our discussion and would be very happy to discuss any of these related topics we've touched upon in a new video series or even in a live discussion which we could record and then post. Now, regarding delusion. I think religion and spiritual belief fall in a broad spectrum. Near one extreme, there is the father that, despite living in a modern society, prays over his sick and dying child because he is sure her illness is a result of sin and that taking her to a doctor would be tantamount to doubting God, an offense he would surely punish severely. I'm no psychiatrist, but I would venture to say that this person's view of reality is delusional. On the opposite side of the spectrum are people such as you who hold nuanced views on the nature of deity, whose claims of what we can truly know about God and the specifics of what he wants from us are appropriately cautious when at all made. Suffice it to say that if I believed you were delusional, and thus you maintained beliefs quote-unquote despite indisputable evidence to the contrary, I would not have had this discussion with you. With respect to arguments, counter-arguments, and supporting premises, the discussion began with the observation that there are a plurality of human religions. This is an observable fact. We have competing hypotheses which explain this observation. Your first video, the one which began this series, put forward a defense of a theistic hypothesis. More specifically, how apparent inconsistencies can be reconciled by positing them as partial observations. The entities used in this hypothesis are a proper superset of the ones in the atheistic account, namely, there is the added God entity. So at the time, I thought it valid to ask you to justify its inclusion, since nothing in the observations as given seemed to require it. Granted, this broadened the scope of the discussion, and so, perhaps in hindsight, we should have avoided it in the interest of keeping things more contained. However, it was a vertical move as opposed to a lateral one as you suggest in your abstract argument schema. That granted, there still remains the other half of my objection. Namely, that any hypothesis presented, regardless of the competing ones, must be internally consistent and adequately explain the observation. This is why I didn't want to get sucked into a defense of an atheistic stance. It's because I believe, with regards to this observation, the particular theistic stance you put forth, that several major religions could all be right, collapses under its own weight. Specifically, as I pointed out early, the analogies used, such as colored light and prism, fail to translate because in their case, what's being observed is effectively inanimate. In the case of God, it is a superintelligence that is producing the messages which are the partial observations, and so it must still be explained why a supreme intelligence is failing to make itself understood clearly. Your defenses of this were that God has his reasons, which are likely beyond our capacity to understand, but that perhaps one reason is that he wants us to seek him out freely and sincerely. Here I pointed out the case of Agnostic Man 7-7, asking for a revelation, and how he's likely representative of many, many people. The response here from your friends who saw the video in question was that perhaps his vague feelings of fear and his cat's unusual behavior could be signs from God. To that you added that you see no reason why God should reply when asked to, and that he is entitled to do it in his own time. And so this is what we're left with. A supreme intelligence who wants us to freely come to love him, in spite of the fact it seems next to impossible, at least for some of us, to get a clear sign from him. At this point, the hypothesis has become unfalsifiable. There is no potential observation which, should we encounter it, could disprove the existence of this God. Furthermore, this begrudgingly granted internal consistency has come at the expense of extreme vagueness and sparsity. After all, there are very few things that major religions agree upon, and even then, we have no way of checking the beliefs remaining of this core. Do we? With a view like this, the theist would have to consent that a secular society is best after all, and that when a perceived whisper from God conflicts with a communally observable and repeatable fact, the whisper must have been imagined. And this is the kind of theist which I, as an atheist, would be very happy to live with.